Warmly welcome to this seminar on the Day of International Democracy. Important day globally and very timely since we last Sunday had the Swedish elections. So democracy is very much top of mind here in Sweden. Very happy and honored to have Mr. Jaba Devdariani here, who is the chair of the Georgian UNA. We will be having a discussion for about 30 minutes and then we'll open up for questions. Before we start the seminar, I will say that we are recording this seminar. So if you do, even if you have a camera on, your pictures won't be shown in the recording if we put that up on our web. So you know that. But if you ask questions, then your camera will be on. If you have questions relating to what we're talking about or comments you would like to make, please write them either in the chat. You see the icon at the bottom says chat, and you can write your question directly. Or when we get to the last 15 minutes, you can also raise your hand and I will call upon you to ask your question. So, moving over from that, warmly welcome to Mr. Jaba Devdariani again. And the topic for today is about democracy and also about disinformation, something that we see on the increase in the world. Also, we see it here in Sweden, but you're working and living in a context where this has been very prominent and your organization has also worked upon this. So I'm going to hand over to you directly and please talk to us and describe how the situation is for democracy in South Caucasus and also Eastern Europe and in your region, relating to democracy, relating to disinformation, and also against the backdrop of an ongoing war in Ukraine. So welcome.
Hello everyone, and thank you for having me today. As Cecilia said, I have been chair and one of the founders of the UNA Georgia, which is operating in the country since 1996 in a variety of programs and activities. And of course, one of the core things that we have been focusing since the very beginning has been the efforts to bring the democratic state to a new level, to develop its institutions and to make sure that the various communities, especially youth community, minorities, are more and more actively engaged in building what should become a more modern, more democratic Georgia. And since the topic today is essentially an interplay between democratization and what we see as increasing challenges to it, be it military challenges we see now very tragically in Ukraine, or more, let's say, hybrid challenges that come from the area of disinformation, but very importantly also the weaknesses that could be institutional or societal, which make the countries vulnerable to these outside pressures. You said very well, we're talking in the context of elections in Sweden as well, and we know that there is a particular moment, pretty much Europe-wide, when the traditional systems of democratic governance are increasingly under stress. This stress comes from the fringes of the political spectrum, but it comes very importantly also due to the fact that the electorate is increasingly disoriented in the circumstances when the traditional political parties and political ideologies no longer respond to a changing international order and the national environment. There are pressures of migration, there are increasing economic pressures, and now an unprecedented pressure of the military intervention of Russia in Ukraine, which is putting Europe very unusually in the context of an active, large-scale military hostilities. So what I want to say to begin with is that when we were starting our work in the 1990s, mid-1990s, and we were all very young, we were seeing the situation when we thought, and many of our counterparts from the European states, from the United States, thought is that Eastern Europe was in some ways in a unique situation. Indeed, it was coming out of an authoritarian, or in Georgia's case, a hard authoritarian Soviet regime, trying to reform itself and build the institutions. And when we were thinking about those institutions, we were very often thinking about essentially, well, if not duplicating, but at least emulating the type of institutional arrangements that were dominant in the US or in Europe. And from that point of view, there was a sense of catching up, essentially, to the democratic development that Europe has witnessed, especially after the World War II. When we look at that from today's vantage point, we see that the challenges that the democratic states or democratizing states are witnessing are not that fundamentally different. Perhaps the economic and political circumstances, the lasting stability in Western Europe has changed the circumstances in which the societies have developed and the way they felt about themselves in the mid-1990s. But now we see that when economic strain is there, when the strain of migration is there, when the strain of military challenge is there, sometimes we have the same and similar kind of weaknesses popping up as we have witnessed in Eastern Europe then, or we are witnessing now. So there has been a certain kind of convergence in the democratic problematic or democratic discussion between Western and Eastern parts of Europe. Not necessarily the kind of conversion we hoped for, the converging up, but this converging is happening somewhere in the middle, I would say. Western European states are witnessing more challenges of the types that we have experienced before, while at the same time the traditional problems of participatory democracy have never gone away. So let me just outline a couple of challenges that I see in terms of interaction between the external disinformation efforts, the efforts to subdue and corrupt democratic systems, and the kind of inner growth of democratic processes in my region, in Eastern Europe, and in the South Caucasus. In Western Europe today, when, or well, maybe not today anymore, but before this phase of war in Ukraine has started, when we spoke about disinformation, especially emanating from Russia, we were thinking in terms of Russia Today or some of these Sputnik television and radio channels, that is the loudspeakers of the Kremlin propaganda, that is to say, that we're trying to produce a lot of information, very often disinformation, sometimes simply misinformation. And the efforts to counter that were mostly about countering the sources or countering the narrative. So the debunking of the myths that were portrayed by the Russian channels became a very important thing and very important type of activity that many NGOs have been doing. We at UNA Georgia have been working very closely with one of the very active NGOs in this field, which is called MDF, Media Development Foundation. We have been partially supporting them financially and co-authoring reports that were precisely trying to identify the types of propaganda and disinformation messages that were emanating from Russian or pro-Russian sources. And these are anti-NATO, anti-European Union, very often targeting minorities, especially sexual minorities, but also trying to forge discord between the ethnic minorities that are living in those countries. And this is, of course, a very important work to do. But the more we focused on this, the more we came to the realization that, in fact, countering the sources or debunking of the disinformation is insufficient. That what we must focus on is essentially an impact of disinformation. And this will be very familiar to those of you that are working in the project or programming world from the NGO community or from the government offices. There has been this transition of working from before in the 1990s, we were more focusing on the outputs of the programs, what we have done, the seminars we've organized, the people we met. Now, more and more, we're trying to focus on the impact we're having or not having as a more efficient way to see how what change, what difference we're making. And I think we need to think similarly about disinformation, to think about it in terms of impact. What change is this disinformation making in our society, and why is it making that change, the difference? And of course, it is very, very hard to pin down. Does the mistrust towards NATO that the Russians are trying to foment exist anyway in the democratic community? Is it a subject to a legitimate democratic debate? Or is it mostly imported from the outside? Is the attitudes towards minorities, are the attitudes towards minorities which are not compatible with the democratic state, democratic functioning of the democratic state prevalent in the society? Or is it mostly impacted from outside? And these are all very important questions that cut to the core of the issue of national resilience. And I think there are two elements of the national resilience. One is, of course, institutional stability. And when we are talking about rise of extremes in Europe, what happened in the United States, for example, with the election of Donald Trump and what it brought, what is happening in France with the movement of Gilets jaunes, or the rise of the extreme right, we are often saying, well, these states are more resilient because their democratic institutions are traditional, their courts are independent, their media is vibrant, and therefore, even though there are disturbances, these are normal for a democratic society, and through institutional stability, they will be able to handle that. Conversely, and somehow in the main logic, we're saying that in Eastern Europe or in the former Soviet Union, because the institutional traditions are weaker, then therefore their democracies are more vulnerable. And of course, that could be true. But we saw in the case of Ukraine an extreme test to the state's integrity, a massive external intervention, that even though the institutions can be young, they can be nonetheless quite resilient. It has been only 3 or maximum 4 years that Ukraine has gone seriously into the efforts of decentralization. And yet, we saw that when the enemy struck, the local governors, the local government authorities have been able to mobilize the community towards the resistance, even in the absence of central government coordination, to mount resistance both in the information space, but also crucially on the ground by helping people who were suffering from the result as a result of armed hostility, simply by countering the invader. So it's not only about the tradition of the institutions, it is about the shape in which these institutions are today. And I think that is a lesson also for the Western democracies. It's not that the courts have been operating for 120 years or that the local government have been around. This is not sufficient for their resilience. And I think another element that is crucial for building that resilience is the existence of a unifying narrative in the country that is making countries' information space and democratic institutions immune to certain forms of external attempts to destabilize the democratic community or the democratic state. And this is something that what we are trying to do now very actively with our colleagues and counterparts from non-governmental organizations, from the media in Georgia with UNA Georgia's efforts, trying to find that unifying narrative and promoted so that there is kind of an immunity built, the vaccination, where we have all been going into the direction of vaccination terminology recently, but there is kind of an inoculation of the society against certain forms of disinformation. And we pick, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm don't mean to interrupt you, but you're saying so many interesting things, and I'm wondering if we can just briefly backtrack to some of them, because you're painting a broad picture from your country, from the fall of the Soviet Union. You had a good progress, and now you're seeing perhaps a shift, and you're relating to this. And so interesting that you're saying that perhaps the Western and European countries are now converging at a point, because we do see a rise of disinformation here in Eastern Europe. But can I just go back to, I mean, you have been working with this for a long time, and the Georgian UN United Nations Association as well. Could you give some concrete examples of how you're working to strengthen the resilience towards disinformation? And I know that you have the civil.ge platform, and if you can please highlight some of the examples how you strengthen resilience against this.
Excellent, because that's exactly where I was going now with my presentation. Yes, there are several ways. We have been more traditionally working a lot with youth to facilitate their engagement, also in the provinces, in local areas, in the villages. From already 2 years, we have done what we call a roaming university. We are bringing teachers and professors from Tbilisi-based, capital-based universities, as well as civil society leaders, to sometimes remote villages to do presentations about certain core elements of civics, about some elements of history of Georgia and of the region, and also about European Union and the values that it's built on. And I think that has been a very, very important initiative to go to the field and speak to the people and facilitate their engagement. That works very well. We have been also running a network of youth clubs that do debate societies, that do local initiatives, try to address the problems they're facing in their own places. Also, and you mentioned Civil GE, since 2001, we have run a platform. It's called Civil GE, it's called Civil Georgia, because initially what we wanted to do is to establish a communication platform for the fellow members of civil society to publicize their opinions and ideas with the mainstream media. But as we started it, we have realized that there was really very few sources of information, simply news, that were available from Georgia, especially in English. So by now, already since 2001, so it's almost like 20 years, Civil G has become one of the main sources of information, kind of a newspaper of reference, and you will see it in all the reports, publications, UN or otherwise, that are made about Georgia. This is based on the news and on the information that Civil G has been publicized. So that's one way to break through this information, to actually provide truthful information and to give space to the civil society to express its opinion. And in past 2 years, we have upgraded this effort with 2 sub-projects. One is directly related to this unifying narrative. What we have done, maybe many people in the audience now don't know, but Georgia had a very brief but very active period of independence from 1918 to 1921. And the country was led very unusually at that time for most of Europe by the social democratic government, which instituted several far-reaching reforms, including the universal suffrage, the women's rights to vote. Women were elected to the parliament. Several people from minorities, including the Muslim minority living in Georgia, were elected as deputies. And there were fundamental reforms in school education. There were efforts to introduce Montessori schools, which were at that time very, very new all over in Europe in the kindergartens of Georgia. The university that was already existing was expanded, and the curricula was created in Georgia that actually survived Soviet time, however strange that it is. But that experience after the Soviet invasion, after all the propaganda that went against it, is almost forgotten. Yet we have archives, and there are newspapers that were very active and vibrant at the time. So what we tried to do is to revive those newspapers in the electronic format and to have two timelines running side by side for the 100th anniversary of the first independence of Georgia in 1918. So we started from 2018 to run day by day on the same day the news that were relevant then and the news that are hitting the news lines today. And this contrast and this comparison was sometimes very striking because some of the regional challenges were very similar. There were still the active efforts of subversion from Soviet Russia of the time. There were conflicts in the region with Turkey, the conflicts between Armenian and Azerbaijani communities in and around Nagorno-Karabakh. There were concerns, of course, in Europe post-World War I, the settlements that we're making there. These were very clear echoes that I think was interesting for people. But I think what was even more interesting, and we tried to highlight it in the campaign that was having series of documentaries as well, it was that democracy is Georgia's tradition too. That was the message that we wanted to bring out. Because very often what we hear from the Russian channels is that those states that have escaped Soviet Union or in Eastern Europe, that for them democracy is something unusual, brought about by Europe, by Brussels, or by Washington. And essentially their traditional way of being is somewhat different. But we wanted to see that no, actually Georgia had a very active and vibrant democratic past with active local governments, with cutting edge thinking about the democratic development and participation, with specific people that have built that tradition and nurtured and sustained it, sometimes even after the Soviet occupation. So that was one of our efforts to contribute to that narrative building. And another one that we're having and it's still running is what we call Europe Herald. It's a Facebook-based and an internet-based portal which brings news about Europe in sometimes ironic, sometimes amusing way to demonstrate to people that what is happening in Europe and the themes that are discussed there are not alien to us. They're very similar. And I think that convergence that you were speaking about helps in articulating this message. And just to make a little link between these two, the experience of the First Republic and our today's effort to promote more familiar understanding to Europe, is that what we're trying to do is we're trying to use the language of reporting that was practiced by the Georgian newspapers in the late 19th and early 20th century, which is devoid of the cliches that were then instituted by the Soviet press, and to use that language to report about Europe now. And I think drawing by the fact that we have almost like 30,000 followers now and sometimes reach of the millions of people, Georgia only has 4 million people living in it, means that this is working. And we are somehow contributing to creation of the narrative that inoculates society at least a little bit, at least a little step further from the type of messages that we are hearing from Moscow and from the Kremlin. I'll stop here.
Really interesting. I have a whole paper now of questions, but can I just ask you, you mentioned you work now with this for about 20 years. What have been some of the main changes you've seen on both how hard it is for you to do this work? We're talking a lot about the shrinking humanitarian space. Have you felt, is this harder for you to do now? And also, if you can touch upon the ongoing war in Ukraine, how do you think your regional stability is affected and will be affected?
Yeah, I think these are two very important questions. Is it harder now? Georgia has created from the mid-90s a fairly liberal legislative space for both media and non-governmental organizations to function. Uh, there are no defamation laws, for example, for the media. Non-governmental organizations can register very freely. The amount of paperwork you need to do that is minimal, and so is the kind of the reporting that you need to do to the state. Basically, it's only financial reporting. So in that sense, nothing much has changed, and it has been fairly easy. However, what is changing a little bit worryingly in recent years is the attitude of the ruling party and of the government towards the civil society. And you're talking about shrinking humanitarian space. Yes, indeed, there is a perception of the shrinking civic space in Georgia, which affects both the media. There have been several how shall I put it, hybrid attacks at the leading televisions that were having more of an opposition agenda, the attempt to kind of throttle them financially and to change the leadership boards, etc., which would eventually take them out of the air. So it's not as hard as what we have seen in Russia at the point of rise of Putin's regime, but it's more similar to what we have seen in Hungary. When it's kind of more through business transactions and pressure that the space for the independent televisions is being reduced. When it comes to non-governmental organizations, in recent years, especially starting from 2015, I would say, there has been an increasing effort to discredit the most active and resilient CSOs that work in Georgia. The ones that work, for example, in election observation, or that are watchdogs that are monitoring government finance. And then the ruling party leaders have been increasingly tapping into the vocabulary of, well, these are foreign funded organizations. How do we know if they're transparent? What are they spending their money on? So there is this feeling of unease. This has not yet transformed into any kind of a legislative or regulatory repression. But there have been elements when, for example, the leading election watchdog was excluded from the government working group to work on the reform of the election legislation. So there are some worrying signals. That's why we are trying to address with our colleagues and counterparts. So yes, it is a worrying situation, but I would say in Georgia, circumstances are significantly better than in its immediate neighborhood. Then again, sometimes we are saying with my friends that we're having a little bit of a tragic neighborhood in that sense. To be a state with wishing to develop in the democratic directions when your neighbors is Turkey and Russia, two big regional powers. And in a sub-region, you have Azerbaijan with a fairly authoritarian state, and Armenia, which is also trying to make steps towards democratization, but is squeezed by other national security considerations, as we have seen recently, is not easy. Georgia would like to compare itself more with Eastern Europe, more with Central Europe, with Moldova, but even with the Balkans, even compared to the Balkans, there are several indicators, Georgia is ahead. But the worry is that the circumstance that you have mentioned, the regional security circumstances developing in the direction which is seriously impairing the ability of Georgia to go down the democratization path. So if you are talking about the impact of the war in Ukraine, of course, even before Ukraine, there was a war in Georgia, the Russian intervention in Georgia in 2008, and the resulting formal occupation of the two provinces. And of course, that had an impact on Georgia. Before, there was a feeling that even with very serious reservations and problems that the Georgia's democratic advancement had, there was a sense of positive momentum and dynamic. We had problems and very serious ones that needed to be overcome, but the direction was broadly speaking correct. After this occupation and the shock that it caused, and even though the war lasted only for 5 days, still there was a real feeling of danger, of acute feeling of vulnerability that I think still has repercussions in Georgia's politics now. When the war in Ukraine started, of course, this trauma has resurfaced, both in 2014 and now with this new stage of war. People feel devoid of agency in certain ways. Things are happening around us, but it's such an overwhelming force that being deployed that one has the feeling that you as an individual or you as a relatively small state, if push comes to shove, you cannot do much to change it. And I think this brings us full circle to the impact of disinformation, because I think one of the most profound ways in which disinformation operates is by imparting the feeling of powerlessness on part of the population, of telling you that as a part of the community, you are not capable of achieving much, of changing much. And here ties all these conspiracy theories that, you know, there are certain forces that we would not name that are governing your life every day. And we saw even the research that we ourselves have done that there is a very strong correlation towards believing in conspiracy theories per se and in believing Russian propaganda. And this cuts across the age groups, it cuts across the social categories. And I think one of the, on the state level, the willingness and the readiness of Russia to go through brutal intervention is also imparting the feeling of the state like Georgia of being able to resist this in any kind of meaningful way. Of course, the heroic resistance of Ukraine now is counterbalancing this a little bit, and this is a very interesting moment when the two narratives clash. And we will see the effect of that further down the road, also depending in what way the things will develop on the ground in Ukraine.
We have some questions and we're about 10 minutes left. Could you just say, I mean, going back to, are we converging? I think we have a lot as a Nordic state also to learn from your experience. So what would you say are your 3 greatest tips to us? How do we identify and how do we best inoculate against, vaccinate against disinformation? What should be some trigger words? What are red flags going up? And also you mentioned this unifying narrative. I'm intrigued by that concept. And what are your suggestions to us?
Yeah, well, I think The Economist once quipped when talking about Eastern Europe that in Eastern Europe, when you are talking about Europe in general or Europeanization, you are talking about something between Finland and perfection. So I think from the point of view of South Caucasus, the Nordic states and Sweden as well have been kind of examples where this unifying narrative is the strongest. And I have personally worked with the anti-disinformation handbooks that were produced, I think, in collaboration with Lund University by the Ministry of Emergencies, which is an excellent book, specifically because it speaks to civil servants directly and tells them not to mix the external malevolent disinformation and the legitimate national debate. And I think that is a very, very important message that you already have and you have to retain. When you are saying, you know, about the convergence and the things that you might want to learn or things that we can warn against, one thing is never take democracy for granted. Things happen, as with the bankruptcy, you know, things happen slowly and then very fast. The erosion of public trust in democratic institutions is a very gradual process, but after it reaches a certain critical point, and it's different for every particular country, then things simply collapse. once the faith in democratic institutions is gone, it's very hard to bring it back, because that's where the cynicism sets in. And cynicism breeds inactivity and apathy. And what kills democratic state is the apathy of its citizens. Democracy cannot function if the citizens don't participate. I think that's more than three messages, but I think that's the core of what I want to.
Yeah, and the apathy and the powerlessness are so very interlinked, of course. I think, Pearl, we can add a link in the chat to this report from Lund University and the Swedish Agency of Civil Contingency, which MSB produced that. We have a question in the chat, and why is it important to work with youth? Because you do that a lot, specifically directed with the Traveling University and the youth clubs. Why is that so important, do you think, to increase their sense of agency in these democratic processes?
Well, precisely because of the reasons, precisely because one needs to counter the apathy and powerlessness, and youth are the ones that are not that cynical, hopefully, as the older generation of citizens, that still believe that change is within their grasp. Also, because they have been targeted directly by some of the propaganda messages and some of the conspiracy theories. We have also seen that in our research. And it's important for them to get the skills, very technical skills, of distinguishing credible sources from the propaganda sources. We work in particular also with the minority youth, which have a weaker command of the Georgian language and are therefore very often consuming Russian news or news in Russian language, which are more susceptible to the Kremlin propaganda. We are trying to work with them to improve their command of the Georgian language. This is done in cooperation with the state. We also help them improve the command of so that they have access to the various other sources. So that's it, basically. We're trying to engage youth in the civic process and in the democratic process as much as possible.
Thank you. The Swedish elections we had on Sunday, when we started analyzing how people had voted, I think I was at least surprised to see that for the first time in a long time, youth tended to vote more to the right, more conservative party. Have you seen a shift? And I think this has to do with their sense of powerlessness and also hopelessness. Have you seen a shift from the end of the fall of the Soviet Union to now, how youth view the future?
I think what we have been worried in Georgia for a long time is a kind of abyss that has been becoming deeper and deeper between more urban youth that are fluent in English, are having access to the Western universities, that are consuming information increasingly from the West, and this is a trend that started from mid 1990s, right? And the ones that tend to be more rural, but even that is changing a little bit, and that's that urban as well, but who are very strongly influenced by radical conservative narratives, very often promoted by the Georgian Orthodox Church, which in itself is quite heavily influenced by the Russian Orthodox Church.
Okay.
So that has been indeed a kind of the divide that has proven very difficult to bridge. And then what we are worried about when we're discussing this is that these are kind of polarized ghettos in use that don't interact much, and interact even less with the advent of social media and the role it plays in shaping public debate. So that is something that is concerning to us. I don't know to what extent that phenomenon is manifesting itself in the same way in Sweden.
I think we're definitely seeing changes here in Sweden, but perhaps a bit in the beginning of them. Before we're going to wrap up in about a minute here, but before we do that, can I just ask you, if you look at the future, given the situation in Ukraine, and when you look at youth, the situation for civil society, funding globally, the state of multilateralism, are you still, because I'm assuming you have been hopeful, are you still hopeful and positive towards societal development, or are you more concerned now?
This is a very hard question. It's a very personal question as well, because when I woke up on the 24th of February and saw what was happening, I had a feeling that essentially everything that I worked for all of my professional life has just disappeared. Everything that I was working for in Georgia, everything that I've been working on in the Balkans for almost 10 years, the motivating people that the democratic statehood is possible, and that this is the future, the European multilateralism. It was a very hard moment. I have to say that what happened since gave me a little bit of hope on several levels. One is that the mobilization of Europe has happened on the larger scale and more quickly than I expected, honestly, in support of Ukraine. The example that Ukraine gave, that the citizens that are believing in their country and their institution can put up a resistance even faced with such a brutal invasion, is a positive lesson and is a very strong narrative. And we have to be very careful about sustaining it. But so now my feeling is more mixed. I'm kind of torn between these two. One thing that I know is that this war, it is a catastrophic development in a scientific sense of this word. Afterwards will never be the continuation of what was there before. I'm not sure this is felt particularly the same way by especially citizens in Western Europe. I think it's a high time that this message reaches them. Things are going to change fundamentally. And some of these fundamental changes will be very difficult to assess. It's almost impossible to assess now. One thing, I know, one very simple thing, there is this famous phrase, I think it was François Mitterrand who said once, the Soviet Union was collapsing, and he commented about nationalism is always wrong. The sentiment that Europe carried away from World War II. But now with Ukraine, I think we see that the patriotic nationalism is sometimes only thing that keeps the country alive. You need to mobilize and harness that force even in the democratic community, because it's a power of survival. It is hard to reconcile that with some of the more left-wing thinking that has been dominant in parts of Western Europe. The left needs to embrace patriotism, just in the same way, like, for example, Swedish Social Democratic Party made a step towards the NATO, even though that is something that is not instinctively what that party was standing for decades. And that is a very fundamental shift that will be happening. In Georgia, what we will be seeing also is the very increasing role of regional players, the role that Turkey is playing now across the board, not only in relation to the conflict in Ukraine, but in Syria, across Northern Africa. Its relation to Europe is something very different, and it's going to grow. So there are going to be developments that we are not yet very ready for, and we need to prepare our societies to meet them, to meet that challenge.
Okay. Well, very well spoken last words, and really passes the baton over to us that we need to be prepared and also take steps to inoculate our country and to be strong and resilient.
And I think that the partnerships like ours are very important. I think we have to work together on this. And if there is this convergence, then we have even more to share.
Right. And on that point, we will be closing now. And firstly, a big thank you, Jabba Devdariani, for joining us. I've learned so much, and I'm really looking forward to our continuing cooperation between our United Nations associations. If you found this seminar interesting, for those of you who are listening, please check out our website. We have right now an international intern, a Swedish person in place in Georgia throughout this fall. She will be on our blog writing about her experiences, and also please join us as a member and you can receive continued information on how we are working together with Georgia on this issue, and also what we can learn here in Sweden in our work. So thank you to all for joining this seminar. Bye.
Thank you very much.